My daughter-in-law looked me dead in the eye at Thanksgiving dinner and said, "Take this miserable man away from our table." I sat there holding my fork, watching my son Marcus nod in agreement while the whole restaurant went silent. What she didn't know was that I owned every brick, every table, every soul food recipe hanging on those walls. I remember sitting in that booth afterward, staring at my reflection in the window. The smell of cornbread and collard greens still hung in the air like a prayer I'd whispered 1,000 times. My hands were shaking, not from age, but from the weight of 30 years of building something beautiful, just to watch it crumble in one cruel sentence. The restaurant buzzed around me, but I felt like I was trapped in a snow globe someone had shaken too hard. If you've ever been thrown away by the people you'd die for, if you've ever watched your own blood choose strangers over you, then pull up a chair. This story's got some bitter coffee, but it's got truth too. Sometimes the people we love the most are the ones who hurt us the deepest. And sometimes the only way to heal is to let them see exactly what they've lost. I've been running Bobby's Soul Kitchen for 3 decades, watching families come together over my grandmother's mac and cheese recipe. I've seen proposals, celebrations, and farewells, but I never thought I'd see my own family fall apart right here in my dining room. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man they called miserable had spent his whole life making people happy, one plate at a time. That Thanksgiving changed everything. Not just for me, but for everyone who thought they knew Bobby Washington. See, I'd kept my ownership of this place quiet for years, letting folks think I was just another old man who liked to hang around. My son Marcus knew, of course, but I'd asked him to keep it between us. I didn't want people treating me different, didn't want the fake smiles that come when they know you sign their paychecks. The restaurant had been my sanctuary, my pride, my legacy. Every dollar I'd earned washing dishes at the Peachtree Hotel had gone into this dream. Every night I'd come home exhausted, covered in grease and hope, telling my boy Marcus about the day when we'd have our own place. When his mama died in that car accident, this restaurant became our lifeline, our way to honor her memory and build something lasting. But success has a way of changing people, and money has a way of making folks forget where they came from. If you like stories where the underdog gets his due, where truth cuts deeper than any knife, then hit that subscribe button. I'm Bobby Washington, and this is the story of how my daughter-in-law's cruelest words became her biggest mistake. Stick around. This tale's got more twists than a country road. Marcus was 5 when I first brought him to the original Bobby's Soul Kitchen. Just a tiny counter spot with 4 stools and dreams bigger than the building could hold. He'd sit on that red vinyl stool, legs swinging, watching me flip pancakes and listening to the old jazz records I'd play on my beat-up radio. "Daddy, when I grow up, can I make pancakes too?" he'd ask, syrup on his chin and wonder in his eyes. Those were the golden days before law school changed him, before Jessica poisoned his heart against his own blood. I worked double shifts at the Peachtree Hotel just to pay for his piano lessons, his baseball uniforms, his college prep classes. When other kids were getting picked up by both parents, Marcus had me. Tired, covered in kitchen grease, but always there. I never missed a parent-teacher conference, never missed a game, never let him feel like he was less than anybody else's child. "You're gonna be somebody special," I'd tell him every night, tucking him into the bed I'd bought secondhand but made feel like a palace with my love. After his mama died, this restaurant became our sanctuary. We'd come here on Sundays after church, and I'd let him help me test new recipes. He had good instincts, that boy. Knew when the seasoning was just right, knew how to make the biscuits fluffy like clouds. "This is our place, son," I'd say, watching him carefully measure spices. "Someday all of this will be yours." He'd beam with pride, talking about how he'd expand the menu, maybe add live music on weekends. The first crack in our foundation came during his 2nd year of law school. He'd bring home classmates, mostly white kids with trust funds and summer homes, and I'd catch him explaining me away. "Oh, that's just my dad," he'd say, like I was some embarrassing relative instead of the man who'd sacrificed everything for his education. When I'd offer to cook for his study groups, he'd make excuses. "We're ordering pizza, Dad. Don't worry about it." But I could see the shame in his eyes, the way he'd rush his friends past the restaurant photos on our living room walls. Jessica entered our lives like a hurricane in designer clothes. First time Marcus brought her to Sunday dinner, she spent the whole meal texting, barely touching my famous fried chicken. "It's very authentic," she said, like that was somehow an insult. I watched my son watching her, saw how desperately he wanted her approval. That's when I knew I was losing him. Not to another woman, but to a version of himself he thought she wanted him to be. The wedding was beautiful, expensive, and cold as winter rain. I wore my best suit, the one I'd bought for Marcus's law school graduation, but I felt invisible among Jessica's family and their country club friends. During the father-son dance, Marcus whispered, "Thanks for everything, Dad. I know this is hard for you." I squeezed his shoulder, not knowing those might be the last genuine words he'd ever speak to me. The man who'd once begged me for bedtime stories about our restaurant dreams couldn't meet my eyes anymore. Those early years with Marcus were the foundation of everything I'd built. Not just the restaurant, but my whole sense of purpose. Every sacrifice had been worth it when I saw his smile, heard his laughter echoing through these walls. But somewhere between his first paycheck and Jessica's first criticism, I'd lost my son to a world that saw me as nothing more than an old man with dirty fingernails and outdated dreams. The first time Jessica openly disrespected me was at Marcus's birthday dinner. I'd spent all day preparing his favorite meal, the same honey-glazed ham and cornbread stuffing I'd made every year since he was 6. But when they walked in, Jessica wrinkled her nose and said, "Oh, Bobby, we just ate. Maybe next time check with us first?" Marcus didn't defend the tradition, didn't mention how he used to help me pick out the perfect ham at the market every year. He just shrugged and said, "Dad, you know how it is." The visits became shorter, the conversations more strained. I'd ask about Marcus's cases, try to connect with the man I'd raised, but Jessica would interrupt with reminders about their social obligations. "We really can't stay long, Bobby," she'd say, checking her watch like my time was somehow less valuable than theirs. She'd never call me Dad, never acknowledged that I was family too. To her, I was just Bobby, the old man who happened to share her husband's last name. When they moved to their new house in Buckhead, I wasn't invited to the housewarming party. I found out about it through Sarah, my restaurant manager, who'd seen the photos on Marcus's social media. "They had quite the spread," she said gently, trying to soften the blow. But I could see the pity in her eyes, the same look I'd been getting from friends who watched my son drift away, like smoke in the wind. The house had cost more than I'd made in my first 10 years running the restaurant. The final insult came when Jessica announced they were having Thanksgiving at a nice restaurant instead of our family tradition at my house. "We want somewhere more appropriate for the holiday," she explained over the phone, not even bothering to put Marcus on the line. 30 years of Thanksgiving dinners, of Marcus helping me carve the turkey and telling stories about his mama, erased with one word: appropriate. As if love served on mismatched plates wasn't good enough for their refined palates. That's when they chose Bobby's Soul Kitchen for their nice restaurant Thanksgiving, not knowing the old black man who'd been cleaning tables and chatting with customers was actually the owner. I watched them walk in like royalty, Jessica in her designer dress, Marcus in his expensive suit, acting like they were doing the place a favor by dining there. "Table for 6, Jessica announced to Tommy, our young host. And somewhere quiet, we're celebrating family. The irony cut through me like a rusty blade. I'd been buzzing tables that day, keeping my ownership quiet as always, just enjoying the rhythm of service and the satisfied faces of families sharing good food. But when I saw them settle into booth 7, the same booth where Marcus used to do his homework while I prepped for dinner service, something inside me cracked. My own son was about to eat food I'd taught the kitchen to prepare, in a restaurant I'd built from nothing while pretending I didn't exist. The worst part wasn't the disrespect. It was watching Marcus go along with it. This was the same boy who used to brag to his friends that his daddy made the best sweet potato pie in all of Georgia. Now he sat there like a stranger, nodding when Jessica complained about the rustic decorations, agreeing when she suggested they should find somewhere more upscale for Christmas. I'd lost my son long before that Thanksgiving dinner, but seeing him in my restaurant, ashamed of everything I'd built for him, made the grief feel fresh as an open wound. The moment that destroyed everything came right after I'd set down their appetizer plates. Jessica looked up from her phone, saw me clearing the neighboring table, and her face twisted with disgust. "Excuse me," she called out loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. "Could someone please take this miserable man away from our table?" The dining room went silent except for the soft jazz playing overhead, the same music I'd been playing since the day I opened this place. Marcus didn't even flinch. My own son. The boy I'd carried on my shoulders through these very aisles when they were just concrete floors and pipe dreams, sat there cutting his cornbread like nothing happened. "Babe, just let him work," he said quietly, but not quietly enough. He couldn't even look at me, couldn't find the courage to defend the man who'd worked 3 jobs to pay for his law degree. In that moment, I realized I hadn't lost my son gradually. He'd been dead to me for years, and I'd just been talking to his ghost. The other diners were staring now, some with pity, others with the kind of uncomfortable curiosity that comes when you witness someone's dignity being stripped away in public. Sarah appeared at my elbow, her hand gentle on my arm. "Bobby, why don't you take your break?" she whispered, trying to rescue me from my own humiliation. But I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process that my daughter-in-law had just called me miserable in the restaurant I'd built with my bare hands and broken heart. Jessica wasn't finished. She turned to Tommy, our teenage host who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "Is this how you run things here? Letting vagrant-looking people bother paying customers?" Her voice carried across the room like a slap. Tommy's eyes went wide. He knew exactly who I was, had seen me sign his paychecks, had listened to me tell stories about the early days when we were just getting started. But he was 17 and terrified. So he just stammered an apology and promised to handle the situation. That's when Marcus finally spoke up, but not the way I'd hoped. "Look, the service here is usually better," he told his wife, patting her hand like she was the victim in this nightmare. "Maybe we should just focus on our meal." He still hadn't acknowledged me, still hadn't said my name, still treated me like I was invisible. The boy who used to run to me crying when kids at school called him names now sat there watching strangers humiliate his father without saying a word. I found my voice somewhere deep in my chest, somewhere past the pain and the shock. "I'll leave you folks to your dinner," I said, my words steady even though my hands were shaking. Jessica smiled, satisfied that she'd won whatever war she thought we were fighting. Marcus finally looked at me then, and for just a second, I saw the little boy he used to be, the one who'd promised to take care of me when I got old. But the moment passed, and he was a stranger again. Walking away from that table felt like walking away from 30 years of fatherhood, 30 years of sacrifice, 30 years of believing that love could overcome anything. As I headed toward my office in the back of the restaurant, I heard Jessica laugh, actually laugh, at something Marcus said. The sound followed me like an echo of everything I'd lost, everything I'd given up, and everything my family would never understand they'd thrown away. I sat in my office for 20 minutes staring at the wall covered in photos from the restaurant's history. There was Marcus at age 8, wearing a tiny apron and grinning beside my first commercial stove. There was his high school graduation picture, where he'd insisted I stand next to him because my dad's the strongest man I know. And there was the photo from our grand reopening after the kitchen fire of 2018. Marcus in his lawyer suit, arm around my shoulders, both of us smiling like we'd conquered the world together. The knock on my door was gentle. Sarah peered in, her face full of concern and righteous anger. "Bobby, what just happened out there was wrong. Dead wrong." I could hear the tremor in her voice, the same fury I was feeling but couldn't express. Sarah had worked for me for 15 years, had watched Marcus grow up in this restaurant, had seen him transform from a proud son to a man who acted like his father was a stranger. "You want me to ask them to leave?" she offered, her hand already reaching for the phone. But I shook my head. This was bigger than one Thanksgiving dinner, bigger than Jessica's cruelty or Marcus's cowardice. This was about the fact that my own son had become someone I didn't recognize, someone who'd rather watch his father be humiliated than risk his wife's disapproval. "Let them finish their meal," I told Sarah. "They're paying customers." The words tasted like poison in my mouth, but they were true. In this moment, that's all my family was to me. Customers who happened to share my last name. I stayed hidden in my office until I heard their laughter fade and the front door chime their exit. Tommy knocked softly and slipped inside, his young face twisted with guilt. "Mr. Washington, I'm so sorry. I didn't know what to do. She was so mean, and Marcus just..." He trailed off, but I understood. He was 17, working his first job, caught between protecting his boss and avoiding a scene. "You did fine, son," I told him, though the word son felt strange now. Sometimes doing nothing is the safest choice. The restaurant closed at 9 that night, but I stayed until midnight. walking through the empty dining room and remembering better times. This place had been my church, my sanctuary, my proof that a poor black man from the projects could build something beautiful and lasting. Every table had memories. The couple who had their first date in booth 3, the family who celebrated 3 generations of birthdays at table 12, the lonely souls who'd found community at my counter. But now it felt contaminated by my family's rejection. I went home to my empty house and sat in Marcus's old bedroom, surrounded by his childhood trophies and school photos. The silence was deafening. No phone calls, no apologies, no acknowledgement of what had happened. In Marcus's world, I'd simply been an embarrassing interruption to their perfect Thanksgiving dinner. In Jessica's world, I was just another old black man who needed to know his place. And in my world, I was a father who'd failed to raise a son with enough courage to defend the man who'd given him everything. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I called my lawyer and asked him to prepare some documents. If my family wanted to treat me like a stranger, then perhaps it was time they learned what losing a stranger really meant. Some lessons can only be taught through consequences, and some pain can only be healed through truth. My silence had protected them long enough. The truth came out 3 days later, not because I planned it, but because Jessica made one mistake too many. She'd posted a review online, trashing Bobby's Soul Kitchen for unprofessional staff and inappropriate behavior from vagrant customers. She tagged the restaurant, tagged her friends, even tagged the local food blogger who'd given us a 5-star review the month before. That's when Sarah showed me her phone, fire in her eyes and my business's reputation on the line. "Bobby, she's trying to destroy everything you built," Sarah said, scrolling through the comments where Jessica's society friends were piling on with their own fake outrage. "She's claiming we let random homeless people harass paying customers. She's demanding the owner fire the disturbed old man who ruined their family dinner." The irony was so thick you could cut it with a butter knife. My daughter-in-law was trying to get me fired from my own restaurant. I'd planned to stay quiet, to let the wound heal privately and maintain my family's dignity. But watching Jessica lie about my character, attack my staff, and try to damage the business I'd spent 30 years building changed everything. "Sarah," I said, my voice calm but my heart pounding, "call that food blogger. Tell her I'm ready to do that owner interview she's been requesting, and make sure Jessica sees it when it publishes." The interview ran the next morning with a photo of me behind the counter, wearing my apron, with the headline, "The Hidden Story Behind Atlanta's Bobby's Soul Kitchen. Owner Bobby Washington's Journey from Poverty to Success." The article detailed my rise from dishwasher to restaurant owner, my commitment to authentic soul food, and my pride in serving the community for 3 decades. But the most powerful part was my quote about family. The hardest lesson in business is that sometimes the people closest to you are the ones who understand your worth the least. My phone started ringing within an hour. First, it was customers calling to apologize for Jessica's review, sharing their own stories about how Bobby's Soul Kitchen had been part of their family traditions for years. Then it was other restaurant owners in the neighborhood, expressing solidarity and sharing their respect for what I'd built. The local news picked up the story, fascinated by the humble millionaire who still bussed tables in his own establishment because he loved connecting with customers. But the call I'd been dreading came that afternoon. Marcus's voice was small, shocked, confused. "Dad, I saw the article. I had no idea you..." He trailed off, and I could hear Jessica in the background, her voice sharp with panic. She'd realized that she'd publicly humiliated one of Atlanta's most respected black business owners, that her racist assumptions had been broadcast to the world through her own social media accounts. The vagrant she'd tried to remove was actually the man signing the checks. "You had no idea because you never asked," I told my son, my voice steady but my heart breaking all over again. "You were so busy being ashamed of who I was, you forgot to find out what I'd become." The silence on the line stretched between us like 30 years of missed opportunities. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with tears. "Dad, can we talk? Can you forgive us?" But forgiveness, I'd learned, wasn't something you could demand after destroying someone's dignity. It was something you had to earn. 3 months have passed since that Thanksgiving dinner changed everything. Marcus comes by the restaurant now, sometimes with Jessica, sometimes alone, always carrying the weight of what they did to me in front of a room full of strangers. They're trying to rebuild what they tore down, but trust is like my grandmother's cast iron skillet. Once it's cracked, it's never quite the same, no matter how much love you put into seasoning it again. Jessica apologized, eventually. Not the fake social media apology she posted when her friends started distancing themselves from her racism, but a real one, face to face, with tears in her eyes and shame in her voice. "I was wrong about everything," she said, sitting in booth 7 where it all fell apart. "I saw an old black man and made assumptions. I didn't see the businessman, the father, the man who built something beautiful from nothing." Her words were sincere, but words can't undo the moment when someone shows you exactly who they are. The restaurant is busier than ever now. The publicity brought new customers, but more importantly, it brought back the community spirit I'd always wanted this place to have. Families come here not just for the food, but for the story. The proof that dignity and hard work still matter. That success doesn't have to change who you are at your core. I still bus tables, still chat with customers, still make sure every plate that leaves my kitchen carries a little bit of love with it. Marcus and I are healing, slowly. He's learning to be proud of where he came from instead of ashamed of what he thought it meant. Last Sunday, he brought his law partners here for dinner, and I watched him tell them about how I built this place from nothing, how every recipe came from his great-grandmother's kitchen, how this restaurant represents 4 generations of Washington family dreams. For the first time in years, I saw the little boy who used to brag about his daddy's cooking. But the hardest lesson I've learned is that you can't love someone into respecting you. I spent decades trying to earn my son's pride, trying to prove I was worthy of his acknowledgement, trying to be smaller so he could feel bigger. The truth is, I was always enough. It was his vision that needed adjusting, not my worth. Some people will only see your value after they've lost it, and by then, the relationship can never go back to what it was before. I keep that first photo of Marcus in my apron on my desk now, right next to the newspaper clipping about the restaurant's success. It reminds me that love isn't always enough, but dignity is everything. I raised a good man who made bad choices, married a woman who learned hard truths about herself, and built a legacy that survived their attempt to diminish it. That's something to be proud of, even when your heart is still healing from the breaking. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by the people who should have known your worth? Have you ever had to choose between keeping peace and keeping your dignity? And if this story touched something in you, hit that subscribe button. I'm Bobby Washington, and I've got more stories about building dreams, surviving heartbreak, and finding strength in the most unexpected places. Thanks for listening to An Old Man's Truth.